Bethel Day 4. I'm getting down there. Anyway, somebody left a link on my little tool thingy here to a YouTube video of this Robert Shapiro guy from 2008. And yeah, it was sort of interesting. So anyways, on the thermodynamic elements of origins of life. And I don't think it's really in dispute with what conventional scientists say. I think it's just taking it a step, previous, a perspective that's previous to. I guess I don't need to hold the camera. Once you start having the actual chemical machines that start doing this replicating thing, the pieces of chemistry, it's just an explanation of how those machines essentially could have been formed. And so you get into the idea of what energy is doing, and why energy produces, or may produce, all of this crap, when basically what it always wants to do is kind of convert to the simpler form, do the thermodynamic entropy kind of thing, and kind of disassociate in an open system. So, I've used the word filtering before to describe how our brain works, even how our body is essentially layers of membrane. There's the main nucleuses are replicating cells, whatever that, I can't remember what they're called, but anyway, they're the core DNA molecule, the one that's going somewhere, the one that's been somewhere and is in a linear path somewhere, attempting to be in a linear path. Obviously, I'm stopping that linearity. It's dead ending here. Mine anyway. I've used the word filtering just in the sense that, we have that core cell, and then we have these other developed walls, these other shields that break thermodynamics, that basically don't allow energy to come out the same way it went in. They're going to force the energy back into the system and force it to do more stuff and come out as in some other form, in a movement. So you could sort of look at a paramecium or some other micro life form, and you can sort of understand that a lot of little stuff comes in, and what comes out is the movement of a mass of stuff inside the membrane, let's say, and it creates this idea that this is the linear path. Okay, the history of the energy is being diverted into a collective stream, like a laser beam almost. It's like the energy is being funneled and forced in one particular direction, or one particular movement through the process of the arrangement of the matter. And you could argue, well, how did the matter get arranged in such a way that it's now filtering energy into creating a mass movement rather than scattered movement? And the mechanism is much, I think, to take this guy's point, it's the end of his videos where he talks about this mostly, but anyway, that's the only part I watched anyway, it's the last 15 minutes or so, is to think about it in terms of this idea of filtering, that's what's happening all the time with even the solar system on a cosmic level. When you look at the elements that are on planet Earth, they didn't originate here. They were created all over the place in the universe. The gold in the ground wasn't made here. It wasn't made by our sun. It came from some other sun exploding. And it came from not just one other sun exploding, but a lot of other suns exploding. It's not like all the gold just came in a blob, like a little blob of gold, and it arrived here and coalesced on a planet. It came as a bunch of individual elements of gold, atoms, and those atoms were filtered by the Earth itself through thermodynamics, through molten heat distribution and the heavier elements went down and the lighter elements went above it, and this kind of process took place of the floating, the filtering of the compound that was Earth. And so all the like elements coalesced, not all of them, but the ones that tend to do that, the chemistry that intends to have very different atomic weights, are because of some other structural, because of the way the elements fit together. Like carbon can be a diamond or carbon can be graphite. So depending on how they're arranged, because of the heat environment they're in, they'll arrange in different ways. They will behave differently when introduced to energy. So it's like if you built elements and the two forms of element were square and round, those are the two ways you could configure the atoms. Obviously the round thing could roll, where the square thing couldn't. Pointy versus invertly, bow tie, where bow tie doesn't go anywhere because there's friction on all sides, and pointy has some chance of going somewhere if it's propelled from one side. So just because of basic geometry and physics, the weight, atomic weight even, how atom will react when energy is introduced into it, when forces are exchanged. Because we don't convert energy, we just convert the forces possessed by the thing we call energy. So something goes in, and then through its orbiting around a planet even, it's creating an energy change. So every time a meteor would come into the gravitational pull of the Earth has to absorb what is its energy. It captures it. And so now it has the potential to release it in a lot of different ways. It can release it as just radiation, as just heat, radiation, by the meteor crashing into the surface of the Earth and heating the atmosphere. Or it could capture it like a moon for a long, long time before it releases the energy that was possessed by the object, that's holding the object together. And from Einstein we know that every atom possesses inside of it, speed of light squared amount of energy. A ton of these little quantas, these little particles of radiation exist inside every single atom. Preposterously high number of, bits, BBs, whatever you want to, dominoes, whatever you want to think of them as, these things capable of moving at the speed of light and impacting other things and exchanging energy. So in these systems that we're part of, like the Earth is a system, the atmosphere is a system, the biosphere is a system, we are a system. There are all these places where borders are created, barriers between one thing and another, a membrane essentially, and through that border is transmitted energy, and in a filtered manner, in a controlled manner. Only certain energy gets in. So that's what's happened on the surface of the Earth. Because of the atmosphere, this more complex biology is possible, because the atmosphere essentially filters out all the radiation that would annihilate complex chemistry. Reduce it back to its elementary nature, just as gold could be put together with other metals. It could be painted, it could be done, all kinds of things could be done as shaped. But if you leave it on the Earth and then you melt the Earth, it's going to just go back to being a vein of gold. It's going to go back to being filtered into just a pure synthesis. It's going to get rid of the impurities once you mix it up and stir it up again. So there's lots of probably just common examples I could give of stuff like that in your life. I can't think of one offhand, but the difference between, like, you could put cream in coffee and the coffee and the cream mix. Okay, they turn into a different color because of the demonstrating the mixture. But if you let it sit long enough, the cream will settle out, the residue, the particulates, the heavy ones in the coffee will settle to the bottom, and the coffee will change. The chemistry will change over time, and if you give it enough time, and you don't let evaporation steal the moisture, you'll end up with probably, a rather clear, go back to water again. And that's, as long as there's nothing stirring the mixture, no vibrations capable of stirring the mixture, no energy in to keep the game going. It's like you can sort of see that if you freeze coffee, you'll sort of notice that the water goes back to being ice. I mean, it goes back to being a more pure compound, and there's other parts of the mixture that'll end up being really densely coffee flavored. So you'll end up with this weird mixture of frozen strong coffee. Well, it's actually how they get the caffeine out of coffee is freeze drying it. So, exactly my point. They make coffee, freeze it, and through that freezing process they extract the water, end up with a resin that's very concentrated coffee, to make instant coffee. So yeah, what do I want to say? There's a way of getting from this beginning, this idea that this is all that's happening, is these layers of filtering, and identifying what the constituents of it is, once you understand the dynamics of the mixture. So it's all about how many ingredients are in the coffee, how those ingredients are being obliged to interact because they have properties, because they have a density and they have a shape, and so when energy is introduced they will act in a consistent manner, and that over time that consistency will create a filtering process. So if you have enough time, everything gets filtered by an environment, and essentially we've been filtered into our shape by evolution, by 4 billion years of this competition. And certainly it's a filtering that could have different nuance depending on what happens. Obviously the meteor hitting the earth and wiping out the dinosaurs probably was our existence was probably completely dependent on events like that, events where you could come down to one individual animal who eats an egg, and if he eats the egg, there's a human beings will exist, and if he doesn't eat the egg, there won't be human beings. There's probably lots of circumstances like that where we could have disappeared because you change one event in the past. You pull one leaf off one plant, and it changes the filtering pattern, the dynamics of the filter, because of what becomes dominant and what becomes it doesn't get to take its place at the peak of the triangle. And so that's sort of what's happening in the biosphere. It's a much more complex dynamic because there's much more chemistry involved, and each compound, each individual is different, each species is structurally different, and so they're going to bounce around in that biosphere in ways completely dictated by their structure. But in the end, what's happening is they are filtering out over time into a residue, into a product. And the product is, in some cases, already gleaned and solid. So there's lots of organisms we could look in the biosphere that haven't changed in millions of years because it's consistently winning. It's consistently rising to the top. It's consistently surviving all the other bouncing arounds, and it's tested by that filtering. And so you could see the biosphere almost like a percolation, where all these organisms percolate, and the survivors, bounce around on the surface. They're not even tested anymore in some ways. They almost gain a monopoly status where it's virtually impossible for some competitor to get to them. Because by the time they attack one member, the last member they are going to get to has acquired immunity. Because of the subtle impacts, it will acquire it just as a matter of experiments. There'll be so many attacks that eventually the new constructs to survive will have to already have their suit of armor on. By the time the enemy gets to them, they've already got the suit of armor. I mean, that's what success breeds, is a kind of indestructibility over time. There are monopolies in nature, too big to fail, success stories. And it's the animals who are in a small niche that are the ones that are vulnerable, the ones that don't have this extra filter of redundancy. And it's, again, another kind of a filter, another kind of mechanism that changes structure because there's more than one of them, because they're in packets. And so it's not about what happens to one individual, it's about what happens to the collective of all of the packets, and that all the packets won't be in the same place at the same time and vulnerable to the same thing. I'm trying to get to my end game, which is bending this to this idea that this is a limited. It has limited potential as a filter. There's only what is demanded of the test tube we're in, or what's demanded of the cup, whatever the vessel is that's holding the complexity. And we can sort of see that the vessel of this biological evolution is based on just a very simple dynamic. The sunlight comes in, it's converted through one life form into, packets of energy that can be consumed by these other life forms, and these other life forms can compete with each other for space and grazing rights and all the rest of this stuff, and eat each other, essentially, steal the energy from each other directly to maintain the chemistry that is constantly producing more redundancy as a defense mechanism against non-existence. It's the only way the matter in the biosphere can survive, is that it has to be replicating, it has to create redundancy, or it'll be annihilated. And so it's fundamental. I mean, the word reproduction just implies it, but I mean, it's a way of looking at reproduction for what it is. And what it is just a defense against the demands of the filter. The filter says you can't survive unless you percolate to the top, and the only way you percolate to the top is to create redundancy. And so it's the mechanism of not so much the natural selection, but the opportunity for there to be natural selection. Cat fell off the couch. Drunk. Anyway, cats. Just somewhat retarded, but it works for them. They have percolated through other mechanisms of association, right? I mean, if it wasn't for their association with human beings, they wouldn't have been created in the first place. They wouldn't be modified into their current form that's completely compatible with the shielding that we create, so they're essentially protected under our nuclear umbrella, another filter. But yeah, this is the dynamics of the universe. It's just these membranes, these captured hunks of chemistry, and the capture for us is this filtering now, where we have different organs doing different things, and we have one organ, this brain thing, that's doing this creative motivation to force the thing to do certain things, to conduct in certain ways, because that's what's going to, over time, through this evolutionary process, be successful. So we have the physical structure that's demanded by the environment in this running of the test tube experiment. I mean, every test tube experiment, if you could redo it, would come out differently, because you wouldn't have the same exact structure to start with. I mean, if you have the same structure, you'll end up with the same result, but it'd be unlikely to be able to pour water into a glass twice and have the atoms, the elements of the water, be in exactly the same position. And it's that starting position that dictates your end result. And it's all deterministic, and it's all just energy being converted from from just a purely linear path to an interaction path. So the energy affects each other, and through that effect creates environments that can't be penetrated by other pieces of energy, that changes the course of other energy and changes the course of other energy. And so you could sort of look like, you could sort of look at the planet Earth, and instead of seeing it as just a bunch of stuff stuck to the Earth, you can understand that it's a bunch of stuff captured by the Earth. It's still stuff moving. It's still stuff going about its business, but it's trapped inside atoms, little circulating bits, circulating, interwoven, and now their path has changed. They're not moving linear anyway. They're not moving their distance thing. They're not doing it anymore, because now it's all caught up in a smaller little cycle, a little unicycle of interaction. And that these interactions, when they become a clump, they become even more capable of trapping more stuff, and now creating something that would be called a new kind of filter. So like an atom, you can have a bit of radiation go in. If it's a certain kind of radiation, it'll have a different effect. If you throw a neutron in, you can disrupt the atom and create and release quite a bit of energy, an entire, large amounts of photons, because you can essentially disrupt the atomic weight of the atom. And that's essentially what happens in a nuclear reaction, is each atom is infected by a change in its nucleus, which changes. It's like had the Earth getting a blob pulled out of it, and now all of a sudden its mass changes, and the orbits of the moon changes, and the thing changes, and a lot of stuff is released because of the shaking up of its interior. And and it releases two more of these things, and then two more, and then two more, and because it's releasing more of the things that caused it disruption, you get a chain reaction that creates a tremendous amount of energy release. All right, but the point is that energy goes in one form. A single rock comes in, and if that rock hits, like say a meteor comes in and it hits a direct hit on a nuclear power plant, well, then it's going to have a release. What the impact is going to be very different than what went in. So what comes out is going to be very different than what went in. And just because there is complexity and arrangement in the nature of the matter in terms of its potential structures. But the limiting factor is that there are only these 100 or so elements possible. That even though the universe is whatever years old, and even though every bit of the Earth came from all these other suns blowing up, and it's the bits that make up the Earth are much older than the Earth itself, the truth is the universe has a consistent form and shape. There's limited things it can be turned into. So you're starting with a limited number of entities, and it's only through the arrangement of the entities that in the end you get some sort of bigger thing. Now, it's possible that that's what the universe is doing. It's possible that our cosmos is but one tiny, let's say the galaxy could be metaphored into an atom, even though the dynamics are very different. But let's say it could be. They would have an interactive play that could possibly, theoretically, be part of a bigger system, a bigger filtering system. And that going smaller, you could end up in, Whoobie Land, or whatever they call those Who's. You can end up with Whoville, with complexity of some internal dynamic that is going to be revealed when you start dissecting the elements themselves, are the basic elements of the elements. Yeah, the elements of the elements. The elements that make them up could end up being, galaxy, solar system, planet, biosphere. I don't think that's likely. I don't think it's probable. But we can see it in the absolutes of the machinery, that we can see a basics. This is what you start with. These are the dice you roll, and this is the environment you roll the dice in, called the universe. Probably enough. So it's not as pointed as I'd like this to be, but I mean, there is a lot of, it is all about perspective, and when you look at it from that perspective, what we're doing is like a crystal growing or some other mechanical process. It is very mechanical, and it's structured by these very fixed rules, and that's basically our dynamic is an evolutionary dynamic, a survival of the fittest, which is this is one of the things that gives you perspective on it. It makes you understand that this idea of fitness is a bogus idea. You wouldn't call, if you're boiling 5 chemicals in a pot and one of them is lighter than the other and it rises to the surface and shows itself, and you say it wins. It didn't win by any meritorious standard, so to call it the fittest would be kind of silly. It's what's going to be produced is a winner. There's always going to be a winner of the game we're playing. There's no way for there to be anything other than balance and a hierarchy, and it just really doesn't matter who's on top. It doesn't matter who. Winning doesn't mean anything, and the fact that we have this complex chemistry and even intelligence doesn't mean much in the game we're playing, because the game we're playing is at its core pretty stupid. I mean, as an entity, we're desire creating machines, just like other mammals, and we're just merely trying to satisfy those desires. And because we're doing it in this complex, covered wagons, houses, whatever, art kind of way, it doesn't really mean much. It's still just a mechanism that propels matter, energy, trapped, filtered blobs of matter, through a future of boiling in the pot. And that's it. Time to turn the stove off. That's the point. Didn't get to the point, but it's time to turn the stove off. Alright, hit the button. I can hit it again, though. It's what my filtering demands.